So our purpose in this video is to show you the interface and explain to you how it works. However, if you work with a controller, my suggestion is to spend some time experimenting with those features. Create an SSID, create it with EAP, with pshared key, and try to associate clients. This is not something we do here because you can guess that if we configure an SSID and configure a client, it's going to work. But the purpose beyond explaining the interface is to practice if you want to use that knowledge. So use that knowledge you gain here to experiment in your lab if you can get your hands on a controller and configure your SSIDs repeatedly. That might not be necessary for the exam itself, but it will be very useful for your admin practice. So SSIDs are configured here. In WLANs, there is a WLAN menu that has a WLAN sub-menu, and that's where you configure WLANs. You can also group APs together, just like we did on the Meraki solution, using this AP grouping feature, but that's beyond what you need to know. So there's one SSID for now, which is the one we configured during the initial setup. And to create a new one, you just go New, create an SSID of type WLAN, give it a name, give it an SSID name, and an ID number if you want to do so. Otherwise, the controller is going just to pick up the next ID number in sequence from one to many. By the way, you can have a different SSID and profile name if you want to. And that's useful where you want to name a profile, I don't know, lab SSID, and then you give the SSID, for example, corporate 5. You know, it could be different between the profile name and the SSID. So you cannot have, of course, on the same AP twice the same profile name. So if you have test2 profile on an AP, you cannot have test2 profile for another SSID on the AP. But you can have two different profiles having the same SSID name. In other words, you may have old security profile that is corporate, and then you may have the new security profile that uses, for example, a new security scheme, and that still has the same SSID string. Okay, so you can have same SSID string on two different profiles, but you cannot have the same profile name on the same access point. So profile is unique, SSID is not. Okay, so create the profile name, create SSID, call an ID if you need to, click apply, your SSID is created with some defaults. And this is where you get into the general tab. By default, you see the profile name here, the SSID name that you can change, and the status below. The SSID is disabled by default, so you need to enable it when you want to activate that SSID on the access point. Then below the radio policy, where that SSID should be available. By default, it's all radios, but you can decide to have it only in 5 GHz, 11A, or only in 5 and 2.4, but OFDM, A and G, or only in 2.4 OFDM with G, or only in 2.4 for B and G. So you can choose what protocol and what band you want to have the SSID available on. So, it depends very much on what kind of SSID you're creating. There is no rule here. Default is all, but that's the choice you make depending on what you want to dedicate this SSID for. By the way, I'll call it SSID, but you see the official name is WLAN, and that's because the SSID is a string, and the WLAN is the entire configuration with the string, SSID, and also the security parameters. But for simplicity, I tend to say SSID. Otherwise, in the official terminology, SSID is just a part of it. Then you want to set the interface you want to send the users of that SSID to. By default, it's management because that's the only one we have so far. But you see, if you go to control interfaces, you can create a new interface, for example, VLAN 23, and assign it a VLAN ID number. And when you click apply, you can also configure an IP address for your controller and the port number for that interface. So for example, you can say port number 1, set an IP address, and that will mean that there will be on port number 1 a presence in VLAN 23 for that controller. Define an IP address, DHCP server, gateway, that's the same thing you do for all interfaces. There are also some other options that we don't care about, but the reason why I show you this is because then you can go back to your SSID, go to your general tab and say, I want to send users of the SSID to VLAN 23, which means that everybody associating to test 2 will be sent to VLAN 23 on port number 1. That's a nice way to isolate people on the wired side, just like you isolate them on the wireless side. Below, by the way, broadcast or not broadcast the SSID, default is to broadcast. Non-broadcasting used to be a mode that we were using a lot 10 years ago. It's still the default on the autonomous APs because of backward compatibility, but that's not something that is considered anymore as being good security. So by default, we broadcast the SSID, we do not hide the SSID anymore. Just above that, there is this multicast VLAN feature, What this is linked to the interface group. In other words, you can send users not to one interface, VLAN 23 like we do here, but to a group of interfaces so that you can split users, if you have a lot of them, among different subnets. If you have 1,000 people using that SSID, you don't want to send them all to one single subnet. That would be too large a broadcast domain. So you can split the domain into multiple sub-interfaces, and then you send them to the interface group, and there will be load balance between the sub-interfaces. When you do so, you can check that multicast VLAN feature checkbox so that multicast is tied to the entire group instead of being individually sent to each group. So that avoids multicast duplication in some cases. Okay, but that's a bit beyond what you need to know for the CCNA. Right, let's enable the SSID. I click apply here, and let's go to the next tab, which is security. As a side note, you don't need to click apply every time you change tab. You can configure all your tabs and then click apply. That's okay too. I do it here so that you've seen that I have validated my settings in that tab, but I could have done it at the end of the entire lesson.